The blood on her torn dress had frozen into dark crystals when Beatrice Finch first heard the gunshots crack through the winter air behind her. She stumbled through the knee-deep snow, her lungs burning with each ragged breath as 9 men on horseback pursued her across the frozen Arizona mountains, where winter had come early and brutal in December of 1883. Her fingers were numb inside her thin gloves, and she knew with terrifying certainty that she could not run much farther before her body simply gave out and the men would catch her. And then she would face a fate worse than freezing to death in this unforgiving wilderness. The chase had begun 3 hours earlier, when she fled from the outlaw camp, where they had held her captive for 5 days after ambushing the stagecoach that was carrying her from Tucson to meet her sister in Oro Blanco. The other passengers had been killed immediately, but the gang leader, a cruel man named Dutch Marlowe, had taken one look at her and decided she would fetch a good price across the Mexican border. Beatrice had waited for her moment, and when the men were drunk on whiskey and distracted by their card game, she had slipped out of the tent and run into the freezing darkness wearing nothing but the dress she had been captured in. Now her legs were weakening with every step, her vision blurring from exhaustion and cold. The shouts of the men grew closer, their voices carrying across the snow-covered landscape with terrifying clarity. She could hear them laughing, calling out crude promises of what they would do when they caught her. Her foot caught on a hidden root beneath the snow, and she fell hard, her hands sinking into the icy powder. For a moment, she considered simply lying there and letting the cold take her, but something deep inside refused to surrender. She pushed herself up and kept running, her dress heavy with snow and ice. The forest was thinning ahead, and she could see an open meadow stretching out before her. Running across open ground would make her an easy target, but she had no choice. Behind her, the sound of hoofbeats was getting louder. Then came the first shot. It whistled past her head close enough that she could hear it, and she screamed, ducking instinctively even as she continued to stumble forward. Another shot followed, and another, but these were not aimed at her. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw that the men were firing at something else entirely. Through the swirling snow, she glimpsed a lone rider on a gray horse, positioned on a rocky outcrop above the trail. The rider was firing with deadly precision, and even as she watched, one of her pursuers jerked backward in his saddle and toppled into the snow. The lone rider spurred his horse down the slope with reckless speed, his rifle blazing. 2 more outlaws fell before they could react. The remaining men scattered in confusion, some returning fire while others tried to control their panicking horses. Beatrice stood frozen in the meadow, watching this stranger fight for her life with the calm efficiency of someone who had faced death many times before. Another shot rang out and a 4th outlaw clutched his chest and fell. The rider was moving constantly, making himself a difficult target even as he reloaded with practiced speed. A 5th man went down, then a 6th, and suddenly the remaining 3 outlaws were wheeling their horses around and fleeing back the way they had come, their courage breaking like ice under pressure. The stranger did not pursue them. Instead, he turned his horse toward Beatrice and rode across the meadow at a steady pace. As he drew closer, she could see that he was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy sheepskin coat and a black hat pulled low against the wind. His face was weathered and strong-featured, with several days of dark stubble covering his jaw. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they studied her with an intensity that made her feel suddenly self-conscious of her bedraggled appearance. He dismounted before reaching her and approached on foot, holding his hands away from his guns in a gesture meant to reassure. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and his voice was deep and rough like gravel. I do not think so, Beatrice managed to say through chattering teeth. Just cold, so very cold. He shrugged out of his coat immediately and draped it around her shoulders. The warmth of it was shocking after the bitter chill, and she pulled it tight around herself with trembling hands. Beneath the coat, he wore a wool shirt and vest, and she could see the handles of 2 revolvers at his hips. "My name is Xavier Jameson," he said. "I have a cabin about 2 miles from here. Can you ride?" "I think so," she said, though in truth she was not certain her legs would hold her much longer. He must have seen the exhaustion in her face, because he simply nodded and helped her up onto his horse before swinging up behind her. His arms came around her to hold the reins, and she found herself leaning back against his solid warmth as he guided the horse through the snow. She could feel his heart beating steady and strong against her back, and for the first time since her capture, she felt something approaching safety. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life." "Those men were Dutch Marlowe's gang," Xavier said quietly. "I have been tracking them for 3 weeks. They killed a family near Tombstone, burned their ranch, and murdered everyone, including the children. I am glad I found them when I did." "Are you a lawman?" Beatrice asked. "I was once, town marshal down in New Mexico. That was a long time ago." There was something in his voice that suggested painful memories, and she did not press further. The cabin appeared through the swirling snow like a sanctuary. It was small but solidly built, with smoke rising from a stone chimney. Xavier dismounted and helped Beatrice down, then led his horse into a lean-to shelter beside the cabin. Inside, the single room was warm and surprisingly well kept. A fire burned in the hearth, and there was a bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with supplies. "Sit by the fire," Xavier instructed, already moving to add more wood to the flames. "I will heat some water for coffee and stew." Beatrice sank into the chair nearest the fire and held her frozen hands toward the warmth. The pain as feeling returned to her fingers was excruciating, but she bit her lip and endured it. Xavier moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, filling a pot with snow to melt for water and hanging a second pot of stew over the fire to heat. He worked in silence, and Beatrice found herself studying him in the firelight. He was older than she had first thought, probably in his early 30s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. There was a scar along his left jawline, barely visible beneath his stubble, and his hands were strong and calloused. He moved like a man who was comfortable with violence but did not seek it out, and she found herself wondering what had brought him to this isolated cabin in the mountains. "What is your name?" Xavier asked without turning from the fire. "Beatrice Finch. I was traveling from Tucson to Oro Blanco when the stage was attacked. I am, or I was, a school teacher. My sister lives in Oro Blanco with her husband, and they had written asking me to come help establish a school there." "Oro Blanco is 20 miles south of here," Xavier said. "The pass will be snowed in for at least another week, maybe 2. You will have to wait until it clears." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes at the thought of her sister worrying, but she nodded. "I understand. I am grateful to be alive. Those men, they were going to sell me." Xavier's jaw tightened, and she saw his hands clench briefly before he forced them to relax. "They will not bother anyone again. The 3 who ran will likely freeze to death before they make it back to civilization, and if they do survive, they will be too afraid to return to this territory." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one, then ladled stew into bowls. The food was simple but hot, and Beatrice ate ravenously, not realizing how hungry she had been until the first bite touched her tongue. Xavier ate more slowly, watching her with those storm-gray eyes. "You can have the bed," he said when they had finished. "I will sleep on the floor." "I cannot take your bed," Beatrice protested. You can and you will, Xavier said firmly. You have been through an ordeal and you need proper rest. I have slept in far worse places than a warm floor. She was too exhausted to argue further. Xavier gave her one of his clean shirts to sleep in, then turned his back politely while she changed behind a blanket he hung from the rafters. The shirt was enormous on her, hanging past her knees, but it was warm and dry and smelled faintly of pine smoke and leather. When she was settled in the bed, Xavier banked the fire and spread his bedroll on the floor near the hearth. Beatrice watched him through half-closed eyes, this stranger who had appeared like an avenging angel and saved her from a fate she could not bear to contemplate. She wanted to say something, to express the depth of her gratitude, but sleep claimed her before she could find the words. She woke once in the deep night to the sound of Xavier moving around the cabin, checking the fire and the door. In the dim glow of the embers, she could see his silhouette, tall and watchful, and she felt safe in a way she had not felt since before the stagecoach attack. She drifted back to sleep with that feeling of safety wrapped around her like a blanket. Morning brought watery sunlight through the cabin's single window and the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Beatrice sat up in bed, momentarily disoriented, then remembered where she was. Xavier was at the stove, his back to her, and she took a moment to comb her tangled hair before climbing out of bed. "Good morning," she said softly. He turned, and she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes before his expression settled back into neutral calm. "Morning. How are you feeling?" "Better, warmer, still tired but better." She moved to the table and sat down. "Thank you again for everything. I do not know what I would have done if you had not appeared when you did." "You would have kept fighting," Xavier said, setting a plate of bacon and beans in front of her. "I could see that in you yesterday. You were not going to give up." "I felt very close to giving up," Beatrice admitted. "My legs were about to collapse when I heard your first shot." They ate in companionable silence. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and the world was blanketed in white as far as the eye could see. Beatrice wondered how her sister was coping with the news that the stagecoach had been attacked, whether she feared Beatrice was dead. "Is there any way to get word to my sister?" she asked. "She will be frantic with worry." Xavier considered this. "There is a telegraph line that runs along the southern route, but that is a full day's ride from here, and the snow would make it 2 days at least. When the pass clears, I will take you to Oro Blanco myself. Until then, your sister will have to hope and pray, as families often must in this territory." It was not the answer Beatrice wanted, but she understood the practicality of it. She helped Xavier clean up after breakfast, then watched as he prepared to go outside to tend to his horse and check his traps. "May I come with you?" she asked. "I would rather not sit idle." He nodded, and she wrapped herself in his spare coat before following him out into the brilliant cold morning. The snow crunched under their boots, and their breath plumed white in the frozen air. Xavier's horse, a sturdy gray gelding named Smoke, whickered softly when they approached. Beatrice watched as Xavier checked the animal carefully, running his hands down each leg and examining the hooves with gentle thoroughness. "You care for him well," she observed. "A man who does not care for his horse does not deserve to have one," Xavier replied. "Smoke has carried me through more trouble than I can count. I owe him my life several times over." They walked the trap line together, Xavier showing her how to identify the signs of animal activity in the snow. They caught 2 rabbits, which he dispatched quickly and humanely. Beatrice had grown up in Philadelphia, far from this harsh frontier life, but she found herself fascinated by the skills Xavier demonstrated so casually. "How did you learn all of this?" she asked as they walked back toward the cabin, their feet following the trail they had made earlier. Necessity, mostly. My father was a soldier and we moved from fort to fort when I was young. I learned to hunt and track from the scouts. When I was 16, my parents both died of cholera and I was on my own. I drifted for a few years, working whatever jobs I could find, until I ended up in a small town in New Mexico that needed a marshal. I was 20 years old and probably too young for the job, but I wore the badge for 10 years. What made you stop? Beatrice asked gently. Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. There was a woman, he finally said. Her name was Sarah. We were going to be married. A gang rode into town one day while I was out tracking a horse thief. They robbed the bank and shot anyone who got in their way. Sarah was walking past the bank when they came out. She was not even part of it, just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Oh, Xavier, Beatrice breathed. I am so sorry. I hunted those men for 2 years, found them one by one and brought them to justice. But when it was over, I could not go back to that town. Could not wear the badge anymore. So I came up here into the mountains, built this cabin, and tried to figure out who I was supposed to be without her. They had reached the cabin, but Beatrice touched his arm before he could open the door. She would be proud of you for saving me yesterday, for still fighting for people who need help, even after everything you lost. Xavier looked down at her, and something in his expression made her heart beat faster. Maybe, he said quietly. Or maybe I just could not stand by and let those bastards hurt another innocent person. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Xavier would wake early and tend to his chores while Beatrice prepared breakfast. They would eat together, then spend the morning working on various tasks around the cabin. Xavier was repairing a saddle, and Beatrice mended his clothes and organized his supplies, grateful to have something useful to do. In the afternoons they would sit by the fire, and Xavier taught her to play poker with a worn deck of cards, while Beatrice told him stories about growing up in Philadelphia and her years teaching at a girls' school. She learned that he had a wry sense of humor buried beneath his serious exterior, and that he read voraciously, his shelves lined with books on everything from philosophy to natural history. He learned that she had a stubborn streak a mile wide and a gift for making him laugh with her dry observations about the absurdities of Eastern society life. On the 4th night, a storm blew in with howling wind and driving snow. Xavier secured the shutters and built up the fire while the cabin creaked and groaned around them. Beatrice tried to read by firelight, but she found herself watching Xavier instead as he checked and rechecked their supplies, making sure they had everything they needed if the storm lasted several days. "Are you worried?" she asked. "No, we have plenty of food and firewood. This cabin has weathered worse storms than this one." He sat down across from her at the table. "But it means the pass will not clear for even longer. You may be stuck with me for another 2 weeks or more." "I do not mind," Beatrice said, and realized she meant it. The thought of leaving this cabin, of saying goodbye to Xavier, filled her with an unexpected sadness. She had been here less than a week, but already she felt more at home than she had felt in years. Xavier studied her face in the firelight. "Beatrice," he said slowly, "I need to tell you something." Her heart began to pound. "What is it?" "I am not a good man. I have killed people more than I can count. Some of them deserved it, but I am not sure that makes it better. I live up here alone because I do not fit in civilized society anymore, because I have seen too much darkness and done too many dark things myself." "You saved my life," Beatrice said firmly. "You have shown me nothing but kindness and respect. You are a far better man than you give yourself credit for. You do not know what I am capable of. I saw you shoot 6 men without hesitation. I know exactly what you are capable of, and I know why you did it. You are not a monster, Xavier Jameson." You are a man who has been hurt and has survived, and who still has enough humanity left to risk his life for a stranger." He reached across the table and took her hand, his rough palm warm against her skin. "You make me want to be the man you seem to think I am." "Then be that man," she whispered. He stood and moved around the table, pulling her gently to her feet. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I am 15 years older than you. I have nothing to offer but this cabin and a life in the wilderness. You deserve someone better, someone who can give you a real home and a future." "I do not want someone better," Beatrice said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I want you." He kissed her then, soft and careful at first, as if she might break. She pressed closer, her hands fisting in his shirt, and the kiss deepened into something desperate and hungry. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I did not expect this," he said roughly. "Did not expect you." "Nor I you," Beatrice replied. "But I am glad the world brought us together, even through such terrible circumstances." They stood there in the firelight, holding each other while the storm raged outside, and Beatrice thought about how strange life was, how it could take everything away in one moment and give you something precious and unexpected in the next. A week ago she had been a schoolteacher on a stagecoach, her future mapped out in neat, predictable lines. Now she was in a mountain cabin with a man who had killed to save her, and she was falling in love with him so fast and hard it terrified her. The storm lasted 3 days. During that time, Xavier and Beatrice grew closer in ways both large and small. They talked for hours, sharing stories and secrets and fears. Xavier told her about his childhood, about the loneliness of frontier forts and the harsh beauty of the untamed land. Beatrice spoke of her parents' death from typhoid when she was 20, of the independence and isolation of her teaching career, of the gnawing feeling that her life was passing by without her ever truly living it. They cooked together, their hands brushing as they worked. They played cards and read aloud to each other. At night, Xavier would kiss her goodnight with increasing reluctance before retreating to his bedroll by the fire, and Beatrice would lie awake in his bed, aching for him in ways that made her blush even in the darkness. On the 4th morning, the storm broke, and the sun emerged in a blindingly blue sky. The world outside was transformed into a landscape of pure white, with snow drifted as high as the cabin's windows in places. Xavier dug a path to the lean-to so he could check on smoke, and Beatrice stood in the doorway watching him work, admiring the strength in his shoulders and back. That afternoon, as they sat by the fire sipping coffee, Xavier said, "The pass should start to clear in another week if the weather holds. I will take you to Oro Blanco as soon as it is safe to travel." Beatrice felt her stomach drop. "Of course," she managed to say. "Unless," Xavier continued, not looking at her, "unless you would rather stay." "Stay," she echoed. Now he did look at her, and his eyes were vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "Stay here, with me. I know it is not much, just a cabin in the wilderness, but I could build on, make it bigger. And in the spring, we could go down to Oro Blanco, see your sister, get properly married if you would have me. I am not good with words, Beatrice, but I love you. I think I have loved you since I saw you standing in that meadow, frozen and exhausted but still fighting. You are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known, and I do not want to let you go." Beatrice set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying not to, telling myself it was too fast, too impossible, but I do. I love you, Xavier, and yes, I will stay. I will marry you and build a life with you here, wherever you want to be." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that left her dizzy. When they broke apart, Both of them were laughing and crying at the same time. That night, Beatrice did not sleep in the bed alone, and Xavier did not sleep by the fire. They held each other in the darkness, their hearts beating in sync, and made promises with their bodies that they sealed with whispered words of love. The days that followed were filled with a giddy happiness that neither of them had expected to feel again. They made plans for the future, talking late into the night about how they would expand the cabin, where they would plant a garden in the spring, whether they wanted children and how many. Xavier was patient and gentle, teaching Beatrice the skills she would need to survive in this harsh environment, and she proved to be a quick and eager student. 2 weeks after the storm, the weather finally cleared enough for travel. Xavier saddled Smoke and helped Beatrice up, then swung up behind her. They rode down the mountain together, following trails that Xavier knew by heart. The journey to Oro Blanco took 2 days, with an overnight stop at a way station where the proprietor, an elderly Mexican woman named Rosa, took one look at them and smiled knowingly. "Young love," she said in heavily accented English. "I can always tell. You take care of each other, yes?" "Yes," Xavier said firmly, his arm tightening around Beatrice's waist. They arrived in Oro Blanco on a bright February afternoon. The town was small but bustling, built around a central plaza with a church at one end and a general store at the other. Beatrice's sister, Barbara, lived in a neat house on the eastern edge of town with her husband, Michael, who ran the assay office. Barbara's scream of joy when she opened the door and saw Beatrice could probably be heard in the next county. She pulled her sister into a fierce embrace, sobbing with relief and happiness. "We thought you were dead. The stage was attacked and everyone was killed, and when they did not find your body, we did not know what to think. We have been praying every day, hoping you might still be alive somewhere." "I am alive because of Xavier," Beatrice said, pulling back to gesture at him. "He saved me from the outlaws who took me." Barbara turned to Xavier with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said fervently. "Thank you for bringing my sister back to me." Xavier nodded awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional display. Michael shook his hand warmly and invited them inside. Over coffee and cake, Beatrice told them the whole story, though she left out the more frightening details and glossed over exactly how isolated the cabin had been. When she got to the part about Xavier proposing, Barbara squealed with delight. "You are getting married. Oh, Beatrice, I am so happy for you. When? Where? We must start planning immediately. We were hoping to have the ceremony here if that is acceptable," Xavier said. "And soon, if possible. I do not like being away from the cabin for too long during winter." They settled on a date 3 days hence, which gave Barbara just enough time to work herself into a frenzy of preparation. She enlisted half the town's women in the effort, and Beatrice found herself swept up in a whirlwind of dress fittings, menu planning, and endless discussions about flowers and decorations. Xavier, meanwhile, spent his time helping Michael at the assay office and getting to know the town. On the morning of the wedding, Beatrice woke in Barbara's guest room feeling nervous and excited in equal measure. Barbara helped her dress in a simple but lovely gown of cream-colored silk, borrowed from a woman in town who had recently been married herself. They arranged Beatrice's hair in a soft, upswept style with a few curls framing her face, and Barbara produced a delicate lace veil that had been their mother's. "She would be so happy for you," Barbara whispered, adjusting the veil. "I wish she could be here to see this." "I think she would approve of Xavier," Beatrice said. "He is a good man, even if he does not always see it in himself." The ceremony was held in the small church, with most of the town in attendance. People on the frontier knew the value of celebration, and they turned out in force to witness the marriage of the schoolteacher who had survived an outlaw attack and the mysterious mountain man who had saved her. Xavier stood at the altar in his best clothes, his hair neatly trimmed and his jaw freshly shaved, and when Beatrice walked down the aisle toward him, his eyes filled with such love and wonder that she felt tears prick her own eyes. The ceremony was simple and traditional. They exchanged vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed her softly, his hand cradling her face with infinite gentleness. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers, and they walked back down the aisle together as Mr. and Mrs. Jameson. The reception was held in the town hall, with music and dancing and more food than Beatrice had seen in months. Xavier surprised her by being a decent dancer, and they waltzed together while the townspeople clapped and whistled. Barbara was crying happy tears, and even Michael looked a bit misty-eyed. As the evening wore on and the party showed no signs of slowing, Xavier leaned down to whisper in Beatrice's ear, "What do you say we slip away? I have had enough of crowds for a lifetime." She laughed and nodded, and they made their excuses to Barbara and Michael before escaping into the cool night air. They walked through the quiet streets to the boarding house, where Xavier had taken a room, their hands clasped together, both of them giddy with champagne and happiness. That night, alone together as husband and wife, they made love with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless. Afterward, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, Beatrice traced the scar on Xavier's jaw with her fingertip. "Tell me what you are thinking," she said softly. "I am thinking that I am the luckiest man alive," Xavier replied. "I am thinking that a month ago I was alone in my cabin, convinced I would live out the rest of my days in solitude, and now I have you. I have a wife, a partner, someone to share my life with. It feels like a miracle." "It feels like fate," Beatrice said. "As terrible as the attack on the stage was, it brought us together, and I cannot help but feel that everything I went through was worth it to end up here with you." They stayed in Oro Blanco for another week, visiting with Barbara and Michael and getting to know the town. The citizens were warm and welcoming, and several people approached Xavier about serving as the town marshal, but he politely declined. His law enforcement days were behind him, he explained, though he would be happy to help out in emergencies. When they finally packed up and prepared to return to the mountain cabin, Barbara clung to Beatrice one last time. "Promise me you will visit when the snow melts," she said. "I promise," Beatrice assured her. "And you must come visit us as well. I want you to see where we live." The ride back to the cabin took 2 days, and with every mile, Beatrice felt a growing sense of homecoming. When the cabin finally came into view through the trees, she felt a surge of pure joy. This was her home now, hers and Xavier's together. They settled into married life with surprising ease. Xavier built a larger bed to replace the narrow one, and they spent long winter nights curled up together, talking and making love and simply enjoying the closeness. Beatrice took over the cooking, and Xavier taught her to shoot, patiently correcting her stance and aim until she could hit a target with reasonable accuracy. As winter slowly gave way to spring, they began working on expanding the cabin. Xavier was skilled with his hands, and under his guidance they added a second room that would serve as a bedroom, along with a larger window in the main room to let in more light. Beatrice planted a vegetable garden in a sunny spot near the cabin, and they built a proper chicken coop for the hens Xavier brought up from Oro Blanco. In May, Beatrice realized she was pregnant. She told Xavier one evening after supper, watching his face carefully to gauge his reaction. For a moment he simply stared at her, processing the news, and then a smile spread across his face so wide and genuine that it transformed him. "A baby," he breathed. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Beatrice asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Xavier said, pulling her into his arms. "You have given me so much, Beatrice. A reason to live again, a future to look forward to, and now a child. I do not deserve any of it, but I swear I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of this gift." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into the fall. Barbara visited in July, staying for 2 weeks and fussing over Beatrice like a mother hen. Xavier proved to be endlessly patient with Beatrice's changing moods and physical discomforts, rubbing her swollen feet and bringing her treats from town, and building a beautiful cradle from pine wood that he polished until it glowed. In December, exactly 1 year after Xavier had saved her in the snow, Beatrice went into labor. The midwife from Oro Blanco, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, had come up to the cabin a week earlier to wait for the birth. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, but finally, as the sun was setting on December 15th, Beatrice gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Xavier wept when Mrs. Henderson placed the infant in his arms. "He is perfect," he whispered, staring down at his son's tiny face with awe. "He is absolutely perfect." They named him Samuel after Xavier's father, and he had Beatrice's dark hair and Xavier's gray eyes. Xavier was a devoted father from the first moment, getting up with Samuel in the night, changing his nappies without complaint, and spending hours simply holding him and marveling at the miracle of his existence. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, Beatrice and Xavier's love for each other only deepened. They had their disagreements, as all couples do, but they faced them together with honesty and compromise. The cabin rang with Samuel's laughter, and in the evenings after their son was asleep, Beatrice and Xavier would sit by the fire and talk about their day, their dreams, their gratitude for the life they had built together. When Samuel was 2, Beatrice became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, after Xavier's mother. Rose had Beatrice's green eyes and Xavier's stubborn determination, and from the moment she could crawl, she was following her big brother everywhere, much to Samuel's alternating delight and annoyance. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and small joys. They made regular trips to Oro Blanco to visit Barbara and Michael, who had 2 children of their own. Xavier taught Samuel to ride and hunt and track, while Beatrice taught both children to read and write, setting up a small school room in the cabin. The children grew strong and healthy, their laughter filling the mountain air. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Beatrice by taking her back to the meadow where he had first saved her. It was summer now, and the meadow was carpeted with wildflowers instead of snow. They stood together in the golden evening light, their hands clasped, looking back at everything they had survived and built together. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked quietly. "Giving up your teaching career, the chance to live in a real town, all the things you might have had?" Beatrice turned to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered, beloved face in her hands. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "This life, here with you, with our children, is more than I ever dreamed of. You gave me more than safety that day in the snow, Xavier. You gave me a reason to live fully, to love completely, to be brave enough to grab hold of happiness when it was offered. I would not trade a single moment of our life together for anything." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and she tasted salt on his lips and realized he was crying. "I love you," he whispered against her mouth. "I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "And I love you," she replied, "always and forever." They stood there in the meadow as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. 2 souls who had found each other in the worst of circumstances, and built something beautiful from the ashes of their pain. Around them, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, silent witnesses to their love story, while down in the valley their children played in front of the cabin they had made into a home. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of hardship and joy. Samuel grew into a strong, thoughtful young man who had his father's skill with horses and his mother's love of books. Rose was fierce and independent, already declaring at age 10 that she was going to be a doctor, a dream that Xavier and Beatrice encouraged despite its unconventionality for a girl on the frontier. Xavier's hair went gray at the temples, and lines deepened around his eyes, but he never lost the gentleness with which he treated Beatrice, nor the wonder he felt at their life together. Beatrice, for her part, blossomed in the mountain air, her early fragility replaced by a quiet strength that came from years of surviving and thriving in the wilderness. They added more rooms to the cabin as the children grew, and Xavier built a separate workshop where he crafted furniture to sell in Oro Blanco and the surrounding towns. Beatrice's garden expanded year by year until they had enough vegetables not just for their own use, but to trade with neighbors and at the town market. They acquired more horses, a few cattle, and even some sheep, transforming their isolated cabin into a proper small ranch. When Samuel turned 18, he announced his intention to study law, a dream that Xavier supported wholeheartedly, even though it meant his son would have to leave the mountain and attend school in Tucson. Beatrice cried the day Samuel left, but they were tears of pride as much as sadness. Rose, at 16, was already apprenticing with the doctor in Oro Blanco during the summer months, her determination to heal people as fierce as ever. On a spring evening when Beatrice was 45 and Xavier 60, they sat together on the porch they had built onto the front of the cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. The children were grown now, Samuel practicing law in Tucson and Rose studying medicine in San Francisco, and the cabin was quiet in a way it had not been in years. "You ever miss the noise?" Xavier asked, his arm around Beatrice's shoulders. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I like this too. Just the two of us, the way it was in the beginning." "Not quite the way it was," Xavier said with a smile. "We have a lot more space now and a lot more gray hair." Beatrice laughed and leaned into him, breathing in his familiar scent of pine and leather and wood smoke. "True. But the important things are the same. I still love you just as much as I did that first winter. More even, because now I know what it means to build a life with someone, to weather the storms together and come out stronger on the other side. You saved me, you know," Xavier said quietly. "I was dying inside that cabin, alone with my ghosts and my guilt. And then you came into my life, this brave, beautiful woman who refused to give up even when the odds were impossible. You taught me how to live again, how to hope again. Everything good in my life came from the day I rode down that mountainside and saw you standing in the snow." "We saved each other," Beatrice corrected gently. "That is what love is, I think. Not one person rescuing another, but two people choosing every day to stand together, to fight for each other, to build something lasting and true." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge overhead, the same stars that had looked down on them that first terrible, wonderful winter. The mountains stood eternal around them, and in the valley below, lights were beginning to appear in the windows of Oro Blanco, each one representing a family, a home, a story of survival and love. Xavier tightened his arm around Beatrice and pressed a kiss to her temple. "Here is to the next 20 years," he said. "And the 20 after that," Beatrice replied, smiling up at him. They had found each other in violence and winter, but they had built something beautiful and lasting from that dark beginning. Their love story was written in the wood of the cabin they had expanded together, in the garden that fed them, in the children they had raised, and in the thousands of small moments of kindness, passion, compromise, and joy that made up a marriage. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Beatrice thought back to that terrified woman stumbling through the snow, certain she was about to die. She could never have imagined then that her salvation would lead to this, to a life so full and rich and deeply satisfying that sometimes she had to pinch herself to believe it was real. The Wild West was harsh and unforgiving, but it had given her Xavier, and Xavier had given her everything. She closed her eyes and listened to his steady heartbeat, the same heartbeat she had felt that first night when he held her on his horse, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single moment of their journey together. Years later, when Samuel brought his own wife to meet them, and Rose came home from San Francisco with stories of her medical training, Beatrice and Xavier would sit together and marvel at how their love had rippled outward, creating new families, new stories, new possibilities. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents, and through it all, they remained each other's anchor, their love the foundation on which everything else was built. On Xavier's 80th birthday, surrounded by children and grandchildren in the cabin that had grown from a single room into a sprawling family home, he stood up to make a speech. His hair was white now, his face lined with age, but his eyes were still that same storm gray, and when he looked at Beatrice, they still held the same love and wonder they had held 50 years earlier. "I was not supposed to have this," he said, his voice still strong despite his years. "I was supposed to live alone and die alone, haunted by my past and unable to imagine a future. But then a woman ran through the snow with 9 men chasing her, and I shot 6 of them, and the rest scattered like the cowards they were, and that changed everything. Beatrice gave me a reason to live, and more than that, she gave me a reason to love. Everything you see here, all of you, this family, this home, this life, exists because she was brave enough to keep running, and I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. So here is to Beatrice, the love of my life, my partner, my everything." There was not a dry eye in the room as everyone raised their glasses. Beatrice stood and went to Xavier, taking his weathered hand in hers. "And here is to Xavier," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "who taught me that love is not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It is about showing up every day, about fighting for each other, about building something beautiful from the wreckage life sometimes hands us. I would run through that snow 1,000 times if it meant ending up here with you." They kissed, and their family cheered, and outside the mountains stood eternal beneath the endless sky, bearing witness to a love that had endured through decades, through hardship and joy, through every season of their lives. When Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep at 85, Beatrice was beside him, holding his hand as she had held it through 50 years of marriage. His last words were, "I love you," and hers were the same. She mourned him deeply, but she did not regret a single moment of their time together. Beatrice lived 5 more years, surrounded by her family, still strong and sharp-minded even as her body grew frail. On a winter evening much like the one when she had first arrived at the cabin, she sat by the fire wrapped in the quilt she and Xavier had made together for their 40th anniversary. Her grandson Samuel, named for his great-grandfather's father, sat with her, holding her hand. "Tell me again about how you and great-grandfather met," he asked, as he had asked many times before. Beatrice smiled, her eyes distant with memory. "9 men were chasing me through the winter snow," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I thought I was going to die. And then I heard gunshots, and I looked back and saw a lone rider on a gray horse. He shot 6 of those men, and the rest scattered like cowards. That rider was your great-grandfather, Xavier, and he saved my life that day in more ways than one. Because you fell in love, Samuel said. Because we fell in love, Beatrice agreed. And we built a life together that was richer and fuller than anything I could have imagined in my girlish dreams. He was my hero, yes, but more than that. He was my partner, my best friend, my home. And soon I will see him again. That night, Beatrice passed away in her sleep, a peaceful smile on her face. Her family buried her beside Xavier on a hillside overlooking the valley, with the mountains standing guard around them. The cabin they had built together still stood, expanded now into a proper ranch house, home to the 4th generation of their family. And sometimes, on winter evenings when the snow fell soft and silent, the current occupants of the house swore they could hear laughter echoing through the rooms, the sound of 2 voices raised in joy and love, a reminder that what Xavier and Beatrice had built together would endure long after they were gone. Their love story became legend in Oro Blanco and the surrounding territory, passed down through generations as an example of how something beautiful could emerge from darkness, how love could bloom in the harshest of circumstances, how 2 broken people could find wholeness in each other. The meadow where Xavier had saved Beatrice became a favorite spot for proposals and weddings, and people would stand there and imagine that fateful day when 9 men chased a woman through the snow, and a cowboy's bullets changed the course of 2 lives forever. It was not a story of perfection or ease. It was a story of survival and choice, of 2 people who decided to fight for love even when it seemed impossible, who built something lasting from the wreckage of their pasts. It was a Wild West love story in the truest sense, forged in violence and hardship, but enduring through the power of commitment, tenderness, and unwavering devotion. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the dramatic rescue or the dangerous circumstances, but the 50 years of daily choosing each other, of morning coffee and evening conversations, of raised children and shared dreams, of holding hands through joy and sorrow, of building a home not just in wood and stone but in each other's hearts. Xavier and Beatrice Jameson had found their happily ever after not because their story was easy, but because they refused to let the hard parts break them. They had loved fiercely and completely, and their legacy lived on in every child, grandchild, and great-grandchild who carried their blood and their values into the future. The mountains stood eternal, the snow fell and melted and fell again, and the love story of the cowboy and the schoolteacher endured, a testament to the enduring power of hope, courage, and 2 hearts that beat as one.